It's the year 1620, and Spain stands as the economic, military, naval, and cultural hegemon of the world. Its colonial empire stretches from New Spain in Mexico all the way to New Portugal in Brazil. Colonial charters in Africa feed the demand for enslaved labor in the colonies, and further expeditions eastward promise new markets to meet the needs and desires of the ever-growing population in the imperial core. The Crown of Spain comprises not only the kingdoms of Castile, Portugal, Aragon, Navarra, and Granada, but the Maghreb finds itself under the encroaching control of Toledo's grasp. Those living within the borders of Spain are suffocated by the Crown's formal attempts at assimilation and the Inquisition's prosecution of Protestants and Muslims alike. Holding dominion over half of Italy and much of southern France, the Spanish Empire is stretched thin, battling rebellions in its frontiers and colonies, while struggling to rein in its unruly subjects. Only time will tell if the Spanish Golden Age will continue for another 100 years or collapse under the weight of its own gold. But how did we find ourselves here at the crossroads of empire? What led to Spain's success where others failed to lead the way? That's what we'll explore in today's after-action report for Europa Universalis 5. Just quickly before we begin, this is of course a campaign I did as Castile, which took me around 35 hours. I thought it would be cool to present it in a cinematic fashion, but of course I'll also discuss key gameplay details and maybe give my thoughts on where some things should be improved. Keep in mind we're still under a content embargo, so I can't show you screenshots from my actual campaign. Instead, I might use poorly drawn mock-ups every now and then, but it would make sense to treat this more like a podcast. One last thing, if you're planning on pre-ordering the game and haven't done so yet, I do have an affiliate link I would appreciate you using if you do, or just use the code CORBETPDX at checkout and that'll work just fine. We begin in 1337 as the Kingdom of Castile, a middling power with a sizable 5.5 million population, but relatively little control over its vast territories. Ruled by King Alfonso XI de Ivrea, who sought a union with Portugal through his wife, Queen Maria de Borgoña, second in line to the Portuguese throne. Tensions rose between Castile and Portugal when the newly crowned King of Portugal, Queen Maria's brother, sired an heir, effectively removing his sister from the line of succession. The ensuing war saw the northern half of Portugal broken up into fiefdoms under the control of the Castilian crown. Shortly after, the death of the King of Sicily led to a succession crisis and ensuing war for the throne, establishing a union between Castile and Sicily. There was little time to celebrate these victories, however, as a new deadly plague swept westwards across Europe. A total 2 million souls were claimed by the outbreak in Castile alone, devastating city and town alike. By isolating the markets and cities, expelling the diseased, and hastily building hospitals, further calamity was avoided, but instability rocked the nation, and mass currency minting had narrowly avoided indebting the crown at the cost of increased inflation. To the east, the Kingdom of Aragon was a different story. Noble rebellions, debt, and instability left Aragon vulnerable to Castilian invasion, leading to the capture of the valuable saffron and silk plantations in Aragon proper. The remaining Portuguese territories were reorganized in the following few years, and a war with the remaining Andalusian stronghold led to fiefdoms in the south and the capture of the port of Ceuta. King Alfonso XI, posthumously granted the epithet the Avenger, would pass away in 1379, beginning the reign of Queen Constanza I. In 1382, the Azores, Canary Islands, and Madeira were mapped after a fishing vessel was blown off course and stumbled upon the island of Ponta Delgata in the Azores archipelago. It would take years for colonization attempts to prove successful, but these discoveries would pique the interest of would-be explorers the next 100 years. By 1400, all of Portugal had been fully incorporated under the Castilian crown, and all former Aragonese territories had been reorganized into fiefdoms, while the crown focused its centralization attempts in Portugal. Navarra enjoyed friendly relations with Castile, with the hopes that one day the Navarrese might accept peaceful integration into the emerging Iberian kingdom. With most of the peninsula unified, the Kingdom of Spain was formally proclaimed, and the capital moved to the more central city of Toledo. Integrating the new territories came with their own challenges. While the Portuguese were easily accepted under the crown, the Andalusian population still lived under discrimination for their culture and faith. While partially under the control of fiefdoms, territory directly held by the crown was prone to revolt, and the population refused to pay taxes. Thus, the fiefdoms in the south were directed to begin conversion campaigns, and the state inquisitors began investigating cases of heretic practices. The new capital also caused issues. Further from the economically productive regions of Leon and Castile, tax income stagnated until a road-building campaign connected Toledo to the north and west into Portugal. The death of Queen Constanza I in 1406 would begin the controversial reign of King Afonso XII. Known as the Sinner in his time, King Afonso would ramp up the conversion attempts in Granada to resolve his impious reputation. The successful conversion of Granada in the following 15 years, combined with the gradual tolerance of Andalusian culture, drastically reduced the frequency of rebellions in Granada. While not perfect, this model of conversion would serve as the basis for future Spanish expansion, and its consequences would define the next 200 years of foreign policy under the Spanish monarchs. In 1420, the port of Ceuta was used as a staging ground to open up a new frontier of expansion in Morocco. The First Spanish-Moroccan War proved the effectiveness of the new standing army. While only 3,000 men in size, its professional status allowed these troops to drill regularly and punch far above their weight when faced with seasonal levies. It was this edge that broke the stalemate between the Spanish and Moroccan forces, which defined the last 40 years. A succession crisis in Naples sparked a war for the throne, with a costly yet successful campaign against the Neapolitan alliance of Hungary, Milan, and Naples. This victory would not come without cost, though, as although Afonso would die in 1427, being replaced by his daughter Constanza, the political fallout of further Spanish expansion into Italy would be placed upon her shoulders. Though few would know it at the time, Constanza would come to be known as the Mad Queen, adept in her diplomacy though ruling in unconventional ways. As Constanza was married to Guillermo II of Dauphiné, it would add another member into the Spanish Union. Though, strangely, she would relocate the Union's center to Naples upon ascending to the throne. This was probably just a bug, but for some reason Naples took Union seniority, and I don't actually know why. Later on, I did fight a war for the seniority to take it back, but when you do that, it actually doesn't give you seniority. It just dissolves the union that you have and then creates a new union between the two countries where you're the senior. Personal unions are one of those things that definitely need to be fixed still. But anyway, posting the Union from Napoli signaled that she had no plans of giving up her father's ill-gotten gains, and thus the first anti-Spanish coalition was born. Constanza sent a plea to England for aid, hoping for a defensive pact. Realizing a potential opportunity to reverse some of the losses incurred through the 100 Years' War, the English King Dythy accepted, and both prepared for the storm to come. A multinational force of the Papal States, Genoa, Croatia, Hungary, Provence, and headed by France, attempted to force Constanza to renounce her claim to Naples, but proved unsuccessful after several years of fierce fighting. Though the Spanish standing army was dwarfed by France's being 3 times their number, France's fractured and decentralized rule froze up many of the levies they needed to push around the Pyrenees. Thus, the war ended in a stalemate on paper, but a great victory for Spanish consolidation of rule in Italy. Even this victory would not come unpunished, however, as the Pope would excommunicate Constanza for her defiance of papal authority. In response, Constanza would enact Pacitum Regium, asserting royal authority over the church in Spain. This controversial move would empower the crown, allowing her to improve tax collection and strip the nobility of a few privileges. This would be the final straw for the Spanish nobles who had sent tens of thousands of their subjects to die in the Italian wars. The subsequent fury would plunge Spain into open rebellion and civil wars for the next 20 years. As a side note, you can actually abdicate to avoid these penalties from being excommunicated, since they only last as long as your ruler is in charge. But since Naples randomly took seniority, it meant that only Naples could actually remove the current monarch, since they're the senior partner. So I just had to wait for her to die while fighting civil wars every 5 years or so. In the fighting, Constanza would move the capital back to Valladolid, as Toledo fell under the control of rebels on several occasions. This wasn't intentional, the capital will just automatically move if rebels spawn where it's currently located. And seeing as I fought at least 4 or 5 civil wars over that time period, I just kept it in Valladolid the whole time. Returning the capital did actually prove some benefits to tax collection at the cost of having to move it for an actual cost instead of just through an event at a later date. Constanza II would finally die in 1455, quelling the unrest as King Louis, the first Dauphin king of Spain, began his rule. His reign, though 15 years long, would only see minor gains in Morocco. Though he did return the seat of the Union to Spain through a war of seniority against Naples, the real consequences of his kingship would come through administrative policy. He would oversee an almost doubling of the accessible tax base in Spain. The Four Centers trade policy would become formalized, dividing Spain's economy into the 4 regional markets of Valladolid, Lisbon, Sevilla, and Barcelona. Regionalizing trade allowed towns far from Valladolid to sell to local markets, bringing down the cost of transportation and allowing them to sell for a higher price. Combined with the expansion of intermarket trade capacity, goods could effectively be sold for more at their local markets and subsequently exported to the other Spanish markets or across Europe. Manual attempts at increasing control in Sevilla and Toledo meant that the crown could more effectively collect taxes, at the cost of wrapping up the cabinet in bureaucracy. With this newfound wealth, King Louis would double the size of the Spanish professional army, sparking an arms race against France, the current military hegemon. The addition of the artillery corps and auxiliary support would transform the Spanish army into the 3rd largest on the planet, yet still far from France's 22,500 strong standing army. In 1468, King Guillermo would rise to power, maintaining the reforms of his father and further expanding the size of the Spanish army. By 1475, he would significantly expand Spanish control of Morocco, capturing the city of Fez and declaring edicts of conversion across the whole of Spanish North Africa. The most consequential part of his reign would come in 1485, when Captain Lorenzo Albornoz approached the king with a proposition to explore westwards to find a route to India. Silk and fine cloth imports rarely made their way to Spain, with exports getting captured by markets in Venice and the eastern Mediterranean. If the Spanish crown wanted a shot at inserting itself into the Silk Road, they would have to take an alternative route. Exploration of the African coast up to this point had proven fruitless, so King Guillermo agreed to sponsor Albornoz's expedition westward. By 1488, Albornoz had returned with news of a successful route to India, making note of some islands off the coast of West Africa that might prove useful bases for further expeditions. Thus, Cape Verde became the target of the first truly overseas colonization attempts by the Spanish crown. By the end of his reign in 1499, the Viceroyalty of Cape Verde had been established, and many began settling in communities in the West Indies. Louis II would be crowned in 1508 after a 9-year regency by his mother, which would see northern Algeria brought under Spanish control. Upon his rise to power, he would decentralize Spanish control in its overseas colonies, establishing the viceroyalties of Hispaniola, Cuba, and the Lesser Antilles. The first 10 years of his reign sparked a new direction in Spanish foreign policy. The newfound wealth from the colonies allowed the Spanish army to grow to a staggering 30,000 professional soldiers. With an additional 50,000 potential levies, Spain's army grew to be the strongest in Europe, and ultimately able to challenge the former military hegemon France. The Kingdom of France was still a house divided, and while their military was sizable, none of the French subjects were willing to come to their liege's aid. After forcing a withdrawal by France's ally Bohemia, there was little choice but for France to accept the loss of significant territories in Gascony and Languedoc. While victorious, the Spanish crown found itself taking on more and more debt over the course of the war, culminating in the decision to reduce the size of the army now that France had been temporarily defanged. To make matters worse, gains in France drew the ire of Provence, who gathered a coalition of Morocco, Zab, and Tunis to launch the Second Anti-Spanish Punitive War. Fortunately, the Spanish army, while smaller, still had time to recover and push back the coalition, but the treasury continued to empty faster than it could be replenished. By now, the viceroyalties of New Granada south of the Caribbean and Florida to the northwest had been established. These nascent colonies did little by way of trade, however, and the taxes they provided could not yet make up for their cost. So far, only rare spices like chili were making their way back to Spain. This is because the Columbian Exchange only triggers in the age of absolutism, meaning you can't set up sugar plantations in the New World until at least 1637. You can probably imagine that this makes colonizing not super attractive for much of the early game, since your colonial nations pay you a very tiny amount of money each month, and the trade is also not that significant. The next 20 years would be defined by financial austerity and economic reorganization, while also turning inwards. The army reduction reduced spending by 120 ducats each month, while expanding food production across the country wiped another 50 ducats of spending from the monthly ledger. Integrating northern territories in the Maghreb also allowed the crown to spend around 100 ducats less on diplomacy each month, and 2 more reforms were added to the crown. The Casa de Contratación was established to oversee colonial efforts, improving maritime trade advantage, and the newly established Council of Castile curtailed the nobles while encouraging centralization and improving tax efficiency. Colonization was also drastically slowed to help stabilize the treasury. This allowed for investments in trade, which proved to expand both the tax base accessible from the Burguesia estate, but also allowed the crown to drastically increase trade profits. By the end of 1547, the debt was entirely paid off and the treasury had amassed 24,000 ducats. Not all was well in Spain, however. The Reformation was spreading like wildfire across Europe. In 1550, the Protestant population had grown to be a quarter of the population of Spain, and the country was plunged into religious turmoil. Empowering the clergy and establishing the Inquisition began to reverse this course and stabilize the spread of heresy. In 1555, a lesser noble by the name of Ignacio de Acuña decided to gather a small force to make a venture into Mesoamerica, searching for its fabled riches. A conquistador, he would fashion himself and his men, though conquer he would not. Barely escaping with his life and a few of his men, he returned to Spain with what little gold he could carry. In exchange for what little he had returned with and promises of more riches, he appealed to King Louis II for help from the Spanish army in seizing control of these native kingdoms. While Spain was already the strongest economic, naval, and military power in Europe at this point, the French were regathering their strength and had recently allied with Bohemia once again. Should Spain wish to avoid another debt crisis in the upcoming war against the two, it would surely be a wise investment to find another source of gold. Up to this point, Bohemia was one of the main sources of gold in Europe, and the newly captured mine in Togda in North Africa wasn't nearly enough for the country's needs. Thus were 2,000 professional soldiers dispatched to Mesoamerica to overthrow the kingdom of Tepanecapan. Success was not only resounding, but far more lucrative than initially thought. Chili, gems, cocoa, and slaves were exported from the newly established Viceroyalty of New Spain, bound for Barcelona, Sevilla, Lisbon, and Valladolid. It was much later that I realized that your subjects start with your laws, and since I had banned exports of precious metals, it meant that New Spain actually couldn't export gold for the first maybe 30 to 40 years. Despite this, trade flourished and the importance of this new viceroyalty became immediately apparent. While simultaneously fending off a coalition from Tunis, Zab, and France, Louis II grew New Spain to encompass 3/4 of Mesoamerica. It was only in 1567 that he finally passed away, marking the end of his 60-year reign and the longest in Spanish history. King Guillermo II began his rule by investing heavily in infrastructure. New roads were constructed all across Spain, and the capital was once again relocated to Toledo. In just 4 years, the tax base of Spain had jumped 350 ducats, around 15% of its prior value. For the first time, control from the capital extended to every coast of Spain, and every month over double the quantity of ducats would enter Spain's coffers than those of the French. While the economy grew, more colonial charters were commissioned for New Portugal and Equatorial Guinea. However, Naples also began to expand their colonial interests. Exempt from the sound toll of Gibraltar, Naples found some success in their West African ventures and appealed to the Pope to solidify their claims. In the ensuing Treaty of Naples, a line through Essequibo split colonial claims between Spain and Naples. Spain took the western claims, having already established themselves in the area, while Naples took the east. Carve-outs were made for New Portugal and Equatorial Guinea, but further colonies in Africa were forbidden, making rounding the Cape nearly impossible. Not all was well in the established colonies either. New Spain was prone to violent and widespread revolt. It would only be a few years of relative peace between open rebellions, and because of this, the capital would bounce between Tepeyac and Tonalan. Without much time to build up control after the capital was relocated each time, New Spain entered a vicious cycle of debt, low control, and repeated rebellion. The solution, they decided, was to decentralize the colony, creating regional administrations which respect the religious rights of the population. Later, the Crown of Spain would directly invest in establishing centers of proximity within Viceroyalty, which would help quell the size and frequency of the rebellions. With the population more under control, trade between the colonies and Spain ballooned in size. By 1583, trade was making up 40% of all income, with chili peppers making up the lion's share of New World trade in addition to gold and cocoa. New World goods found their way to markets all across Europe, from Lisbon all the way to Moscow, and the Crown of Spain served as the gateway. In the same year, a campaign was preemptively launched against the growing coalition of Tunis, Zab, and France. This served to break the alliance between France and Bohemia, setting up an opportunity in the future to once again expand Spain's influence in southern France. By this point, Morocco was under the complete control of the Spanish crown, and now Tunis had also fallen into Spanish hands. The final act of King Guillermo II before his passing in 1584. King Wilhelm III, a member of the Order of the Dragon, spent the first half of his reign consolidating his control over the Maghreb and southern France. Under his oversight, parts of Sardinia were directly incorporated into the crown, and North Africa from Azamor to Temantfost were administrated by viceroyalties. Keep in mind, these viceroyalties are a type of building unique to Iberian cultures. They provide greater local proximity, allowing you to create some control in overseas territories. Greater control in North Africa allowed for further tax collection and fewer rebellions. At last, Spain was not just the economic hegemon of Europe, but of the entire world, collecting more money each month than any other country on the planet. The second half of Wilhelm's reign was spent trying to dodge a potential coalition between France, Egypt, and the Ottomans. While this coalition never came to fruition, it significantly slowed expansion and initiated the buildup of both the military and navy. By 1610, the Spanish standing army had expanded to 50,000 troops, and the navy to 225 vessels, consisting of 40 galleys, 95 caravels, 60 galleons, and 30 transports. While waiting for the Europeans and Muslims to forget about his transgressions, Wilhelm turned his attention back to the New World. Using his ever-expanding wealth, he established the viceroyalties of New Leon just below the Darien Gap and extending down along the coast, and Central America, from Panama up to territories still held by the Mayan kingdom. New Portugal doubled in size, and trade income once again grew to 45% of the crown's income, now nearly exceeding income from taxes. Finally, in 1612, Wilhelm declared a decisive blow to France in the Third Spanish-French War. Not satisfied with his prior gains, the concessions extracted from France were far harsher than any previous treaty. This time, the border shifted all the way up to the province of Limousin, establishing control all the way up to a point halfway between the Pyrenees and Paris. This was the final straw, and a coalition began quickly forming to counter the Spanish threat. As the truce ended with France in 1618, Wilhelm opted not to further his conquests in France, allowing them to join the coalition as he once again turned his attention elsewhere. And that's where we end our journey for today. The Spanish Empire brings in 3.5 thousand ducats per month into its coffers, and controls a vast colonial empire to facilitate the trade which makes this possible. In total, 28 million people live in the territories under the control of the crown, with 15 million living in Spain proper. It used to be around 19 million, but something happened to the population which I didn't notice until it was already past. So I'm not sure what it was exactly. Possibly a plague, and maybe even a second wave of the Black Death, judging by the 4 million dead. Either way, Spain's population is way above what it was historically at this point. Just a few things I would mention towards the end here. This was over the course of several internal patches, a couple of weeks and 35 hours of actual time. Some of the other players I've talked to have been able to speedrun a few games and complete them much faster than I did, but there are so many things to worry about with a colonial game that I feel like they take much longer than if you're playing as Russia or the Ottomans. I could be wrong though, since I haven't played a campaign as either one of those yet. Also, I still wasn't able to discover India in 1620. The Treaty of Tordesillas stand-in can be rather crippling to your ability to explore eastwards if you don't have any claims in South Africa. So as I continue my campaign, there's a decent chance of me just integrating Naples to clear the treaty out completely. I'm not sure how much money you can make in India at this point, but I did just unlock trade companies, so I figure there's a way to make a lot somehow. Anyway, that's all I really wanted to share with you about my EU5 experience so far. If you have any questions about things that I probably mentioned, but not in detail because I was sort of narrativizing the whole campaign, then go ahead and ask them in the comments below. I'll do my best to answer. And before you ask, there will not be another one of these AARs, especially with the CK3 DLC releasing soon and then all the preparation I have to do for the actual launch of EU5. So that's it really. Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed today's video, leaving a like would be super appreciated. And to make sure you don't miss the EU5 videos as they release, you should go ahead and consider subscribing and maybe even turning on notifications. For now though, I hope you have a fantastic day. A special thank you to the patrons this month. In particular, thank you very much to Erica, Born to Dunk, Gallo4, Gorka Maistegi, The Quebecer, Mikhail Sample, Nick Schneffel, Princess Rhea, Qbrute, Spiro, Tillman Augustin, AG Forero, Ben Mottram, Quiet Guy, Rosset, Torvald, Ambient Cyan, Elysia Tatze, James Levy, Luke78776, and Robert.